I like hiking solo. It helps me think. I don't go for anything extreme, just regular forest trails in the more remote parts of my region. I bring my gear, mark my route, let someone know where I'll be, and disappear into the woods for a few days. It's my kind of peace. I'm used to the silence, the distant rustle of animals, the creaking trees, even the way your mind tries to play tricks on you after hours of hearing nothing but your own boots and birds. This trip was supposed to be the same as always. I had taken a Friday off work to get a head start, planning to loop around a trail system that crossed into a section of forest reserve not often used. Less traffic, more quiet. The trailhead was a little out of the way, so I drove out the night before and camped in my car near the access point. No reception, but I had my GPS, topographic map, and a backup compass. Everything was packed and checked. I started early. The first day was peaceful. I made good distance, stopped near a creek for lunch, and saw a few deer in the afternoon. Nothing out of the ordinary. The weather held steady, overcast but dry, and I made camp in a small clearing by late evening. I like to camp off-trail a little, just in case anyone else passes through. Privacy. Safety. I set up my tent, cooked some food, read a little, and fell asleep to the usual sounds of the forest. The second day is when things started to shift. I noticed footprints that morning. Not mine, these were fresher, pressed deep into the damp forest floor. I don't mean boot prints either. These looked like sneakers or trail runners, and the stride was long, like someone had been moving fast. They weren't heading toward or away from camp directly. More like they cut across a few dozen yards downhill from where I was. Could have been someone else hiking, maybe a day hiker off course, but it was early, and I hadn't seen another person since I parked. I followed them for a minute or two, just out of curiosity. They ran parallel to the general trail system but stayed lower, off the marked paths. Then they turned up a steep slope and vanished into thicker brush. I decided not to waste more time tracking them. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder after that. I spent most of the day hiking to the far end of the loop, where the elevation picks up and the trees thin out. The forest gets more open in this section, less undergrowth, more rock faces and outcroppings. Views open up a bit, which I normally appreciate, but I kept feeling watched. Not just a quick flicker of nerves, either. I'd stop, look around, and see nothing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. At one point, I thought I heard something. Not an animal crashing through underbrush, but something slower, deliberate, footsteps almost. But when I stopped to listen, everything went still. I chalked it up to paranoia and pushed on. I didn't stop long for breaks. Something about the whole area was putting me on edge. I reached my next camp spot later than planned. It was a wide patch of flattened forest floor near a dry creek bed, surrounded by low ridges and trees spaced out enough to give me visibility. I set up my tent and ate quickly. The sun was going down, and I didn't feel like lingering outside in the dark. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Small sounds. A twig snapping. Leaves shifting. Not constant, not close, but just enough to keep me on alert. Once, I swore I saw a shadow move between trees, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the edge of my camp. I turned off my headlamp and just sat there, watching. I didn't breathe for what felt like minutes. Nothing moved again. No animals. No wind. Just silence. In the morning, I found more footprints. These ones were closer, circling the edge of my camp. They looped around, overlapping in places. Not heavy, but visible. Same kind of print as the day before, running shoes. No other gear prints. No trekking pole jabs. No pack marks. Just the prints. I packed up in record time. I knew I had a long hike ahead to finish the loop and get back to the trailhead, but I didn't feel like sticking around to see if whoever was out there wanted to say hi. The feeling of being followed didn't stop when I started moving either. About 2 hours into the hike, I started hearing movement again. It would come and go, footsteps, then silence. Once I turned quickly and saw a flash of blue in the trees. Just a flicker, like someone wearing a blue jacket had ducked behind a trunk. I moved faster after that. Not a full run, but close. The trail twisted through denser patches, then dropped into low terrain before climbing again. At the bottom of one dip, I stopped to rest and drink water. That's when I saw it. A tree near the trail had bark scraped off, and carved into it, faint but fresh, was a line, "Keep walking." It wasn't an old marking. The wood was still pale, the shavings still clinging near the base. The letters were uneven, shaky, done quickly. I stared at it for a long time. My heart was hammering. Could have been a joke, I told myself. Someone screwing around. But no one knew I'd be here. I hadn't seen a single other soul in 2 days. I started moving again, fast. I didn't stop except to drink water. Every ridge I crossed, I glanced behind. Every open patch I moved through, I half expected to see someone standing at the tree line. No one ever showed up, but the sounds kept coming. Near mid-afternoon, I reached a stretch of trail I remembered well from past hikes. It curved along a small lake with only one narrow access path, then climbed toward a rock formation that overlooked the valley below. I figured if I could make it to the overlook before sunset, I'd be close enough to finish the hike out by dark or bivvy somewhere safe. But something made me stop at the lake. A set of prints led down to the water's edge. The same kind of prints. Sneakers. They stood there at the edge, just two, facing the water. No others leading in or away. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't like it. It was like they had appeared there, like someone had been standing perfectly still, watching the lake, and then vanished. I didn't linger. I took a longer route around and double-timed it to the overlook. I reached it just before dusk. The valley stretched out below, and I could see the faint shimmer of distant roads far off. A small comfort. I set up my camp near the base of the rock formation, not out in the open, but tucked back into a crease in the terrain. I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook. I just lay there, exhausted and strung out, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. They were close this time, not running, not fast, just slow, deliberate crunches over twigs and leaves. I held my breath. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The steps circled slowly. I could hear breathing, not animal panting, human. A slow, steady rhythm, then silence. I stayed awake until morning. When light came, there were no footprints. The forest floor was hard in that spot, covered in old pine needles and stones. Nothing soft enough to hold a shape. But I know what I heard. I know someone was there. I didn't even eat. I packed up and took the last leg of the trail out. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Not until I was back at my car, locked inside, and halfway down the road. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't think they'd believe me. There were no threats, no sightings, no attacks. Just signs, noises, footprints. Someone was there. I was never meant to find them. They were just letting me know they were around. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't gone back out alone. I still think about it all the time. Someone out there wasn't lost. They weren't looking for help. They were watching, and they were good at staying hidden. Too good, because someone was there. They just didn't want to be found. I went hiking alone one weekend, something I normally enjoy doing when I need to clear my head. I live about an hour outside a national forest that has hundreds of miles of trails. Some are popular, but others are barely used. I had been through a handful of them over the years and decided to try one that branched off a main trail but looped deep into the woods. It was listed as lightly trafficked on one of the hiking apps I use. That usually means it gets few visitors and you can walk for miles without seeing a single person. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-marked, with a mix of pine and hardwood trees on either side. It was early fall, so the leaves were starting to change color and drop. The air was cool, and the forest was quiet except for the usual birds and squirrels. I was making good time and decided to stop for lunch near a creek I found just off the trail. It was peaceful and felt completely remote. After eating, I continued walking. A few hours in, the path got harder to follow. It was still marked, but the ground was more uneven and overgrown. I started to get that sense that I was getting further away from the usual traffic. Eventually, I came across a strange spot just off the trail. It was a small clearing, probably 30 feet across. It wasn't marked or maintained. From the way the underbrush was cleared and packed down, it looked like people had been using it, but not for any official camping. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward it. There was an old tarp strung up between two trees. It looked like it had been there a while. Faded blue, with the edges fraying and the grommets pulled loose in spots. Underneath was a pile of what looked like bedding. Some old blankets, a sleeping bag, and a few plastic bags stuffed with clothes. Nearby, there was a small fire ring, blackened with use, and a couple of empty cans, beans, soup, that kind of thing. Everything had that look of being used hard and left in a hurry. The weird thing was that none of it looked truly abandoned. It wasn't rotting or soaked through. It hadn't been torn apart by animals. The blankets were stacked in a way that felt intentional. It looked like someone was living there or had been recently. I stayed in the clearing for a minute or two, just looking around. I didn't touch anything. I didn't call out. I was completely alone, or so I thought. But something about the air felt heavy, like I had stepped into a space that wasn't meant for me. I didn't hear anything. No sudden movement or obvious sign that someone else was nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly. I've done plenty of solo hikes and backcountry trips and never felt like that. This was different. I turned slowly and looked at the trees around the clearing. There were a lot of them, and it was thick. Someone could have been standing 30 feet away, and I wouldn't have seen them unless they moved. Still, I didn't see anything. I left the way I came, moving quietly and trying not to make a big deal out of it. The trail felt different on the way back. Every small sound seemed louder. Every breeze through the leaves made me glance around. I walked faster than usual, not quite jogging, but keeping a quick pace. I kept checking behind me, but there was never anyone there. Still, I had the unmistakable sense of being followed. About a mile later, I stopped to catch my breath and take a drink of water. That's when I noticed the faint sound of something behind me. I couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly. More like the occasional snap of a twig or crunch of leaves, spaced out every minute or so. I stood still for a long time, listening. It stopped when I did. I waited and then took a few steps forward. Another snap, about 20 feet behind me. That was enough for me. I turned and looked, hard, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I no longer felt alone. I didn't call out or try to confront whatever it was. I just started moving again. Faster this time. I stopped taking breaks. I didn't check my GPS. I just followed the trail back the way I came, trying to keep calm, but my heart was pounding. Eventually, I reached the main trail again. Felt like stepping into civilization. The path widened, and I even saw a couple coming from the opposite direction about 10 minutes later. I nodded at them and kept going. I didn't say anything. I wasn't in the mood to explain. When I got back to my car, I looked around before unlocking the door. I still felt like eyes were on me. I got in and locked the doors, then drove off. I didn't really relax until I hit the highway. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to that camp. I realized something that made my stomach turn. While I was walking around it, poking through someone's temporary home, they could have been standing just beyond the tree line, watching. I had assumed it was abandoned. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe they saw me first, heard me coming, and slipped away quietly, not wanting to be seen. Or maybe they didn't leave. Maybe they just stood there, hidden, waiting for me to go. That would explain why everything looked so tidy, why nothing was torn apart or rotted, why the fire pit looked like it had been used recently. Whoever was staying there might have done what a lot of people do when they hear someone coming. They hide, especially if they have a reason not to be found. And I had wandered right into their space like it was nothing. Looking back, I think I was lucky. I didn't touch anything, didn't hang around, didn't try to dig through their stuff. If I had, maybe things would have gone differently. I think whoever it was decided I wasn't a threat. Or maybe they just wanted to avoid trouble. Either way, I think I was being watched that whole time, not just in the clearing, but along the trail afterward. I didn't see anyone, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. I haven't gone back to that area since. I still hike, but I stick to more popular trails now. There's a certain safety in numbers, even if it's just the illusion of it. That experience taught me a kind of respect I didn't have before. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Some people live out there, deep in the woods with their own reasons and stories. They don't want company, and if you stumble across their world, they might not let you know they're there. But that doesn't mean they aren't watching. That camp is probably still there, or maybe it's moved deeper into the trees, harder to find. I wonder sometimes who was living there, what brought them to that place, what they thought when they saw me looking around. But I don't wonder enough to go back. Once was enough. I had a 4-day weekend and I wanted to get out of the city. I'd been working long hours at a desk, staring at spreadsheets and eating the same takeout meals over and over again. I needed quiet, real quiet, the kind you don't get with sirens in the background or people arguing through apartment walls. I picked a remote trail about 2.5 hours away from the city, somewhere green and empty. I found a state forest area that wasn't too far but didn't seem heavily trafficked either. It had an 18-mile loop that passed through thick woodland, some old logging paths, and crossed a couple of small streams. Perfect. I packed light, just the essentials. A good pack, tent, sleeping bag, food, basic cooking gear, first aid, and enough water to last until I could filter more from the streams. I brought a knife and a small canister of bear spray. Not that I expected trouble, this wasn't known grizzly country, and it wasn't touristy enough to attract desperate people or weirdos, I thought. Just peace and trees and me. The first day was uneventful. I arrived around 10 a.m., parked at the lot that marked the beginning of the trail, and checked the weather one last time before losing signal. No storms predicted. The sky was overcast, but not threatening. I signed into the trail register just in case anything happened, hoisted my pack, and started walking. The trail was narrow and shaded by a thick canopy, with patches of sunlight slipping through in the late morning haze. Birds called overhead. I passed a couple of chipmunks and once saw a deer through the brush, but mostly it was just trees and my own breathing. Felt good to move. The rhythm of walking settled my mind. I'd planned to make it about 8 miles in and camp near one of the small creeks. There was a flat clearing I'd seen on the topographic map where I thought I could pitch my tent. When I reached the spot, the sun had started dipping lower, but it wasn't dark yet. The area was just like I pictured, mostly level, not too rocky, and a short distance from the water. I set up camp, made a simple meal, and sat quietly listening to the sounds around me. No traffic, no voices, just a few birds and the gentle stream about 20 yards off. I went to sleep early and deep. Day 2 started the same. I had some oats and dried fruit for breakfast, packed up, and got moving. I planned to follow the loop another 6 or 7 miles before finding another camp spot. Around mid-morning, I noticed something off. It was a subtle change, just the sense that the trail wasn't quite as clear as it had been. Leaves were more disturbed, the undergrowth thinner. I figured maybe a group of hikers had come through ahead of me recently and trampled things down, but I hadn't seen any signs of recent visitors in the register. I kept going a little slower now. Around early afternoon, I saw something through the trees that didn't fit the natural colors around it. It was a splash of blue, faded and low to the ground. I stopped and looked closer. It wasn't part of the trail, it was off to the side, maybe 50 or 60 feet through the woods. My first thought was trash. A tarp or someone's old rain poncho, maybe. I stepped off the trail to check. I don't like leaving garbage lying around, especially in places like this. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a single thing. It was part of a kind of camp, though not like the kind I'd set up. This was pieced together. A weathered blue tarp had been strung up between 2 trees, sagging in the middle. Under it, a few flattened cardboard boxes had been laid out like a makeshift floor. There were 2 plastic crates, both filled with random things. Cans of food, stained clothes, a broken camping stove, tangled cords, and what looked like an old blanket. There was a small fire ring made from rocks and some blackened sticks inside. It was all old, but not too old. A few things had moisture stains, but some items still looked dry and usable. There were footprints in the dirt, not fresh but not entirely washed away either. The place had been used recently, maybe days ago, maybe less. I stood still for a few moments, listening. No movement, no voices. Just the same bird calls I'd been hearing since the morning. Something about it made my skin crawl, though. It was the kind of camp you might expect from someone who didn't want to be found. Someone hiding, not just camping for fun. I didn't touch anything. I backed out the way I came and got back to the trail. I kept going a bit faster now. I didn't like the idea of someone hiding out so close to where I'd been walking. I told myself it was probably a homeless person or someone living off-grid. Maybe they didn't want trouble, maybe they just wanted to be left alone. But it stuck in my head. The way the tarp sagged like it had been hastily thrown up and the fire ring that looked like it hadn't been used properly in a while. It wasn't a structured site. It was survival-level messy. That's what made me nervous. Desperate people can be unpredictable. About 2 hours later, I stopped to eat and rest. I was still deep in the woods, nowhere near any connecting roads or trailheads. I didn't see or hear anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that someone might have seen me near that camp. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every snapped twig or bird taking off made me jump. That night, I found a spot to camp that was more hidden than before. I didn't want to be near the trail. I moved through the brush for about 15 minutes until I found a flat spot behind a thicket. I cooked in silence, kept my flashlight off as long as I could, and went to bed early again. But I didn't sleep well. In the middle of the night, I heard something. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer sound like when they move. This was slower. One step, then silence. Another step, then nothing. The pattern of someone trying not to be heard. I lay there stiff in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would drown out whatever was out there. But I didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. After about 10 minutes, everything stopped. No more steps. Nothing. I stayed frozen for at least another hour before I finally drifted off in short bursts of sleep. I packed up at dawn, skipping breakfast, and started walking again before the sun was fully up. I told myself maybe it was a raccoon or a curious deer, but I didn't believe it. The trail looped back toward the southern edge of the forest that day. I kept my pace up and tried not to stop too often. Around midday, I saw something again through the trees. This time it was a flicker of movement, fast and low to the ground, maybe 40 feet off to the left. I froze and watched, but nothing came out. No sound followed it. Could have been anything, but my nerves were shot. Then, later that afternoon, I found something else that made my stomach twist. Another camp, this one even more hidden than the first. It was tucked between rocks and a fallen tree, barely visible until you were almost on top of it. Same kind of setup, a sagging tarp, discarded food wrappers, and more stuff piled in crates. Some of the same brands of canned food. I didn't go closer this time. I just looked long enough to confirm it was a separate site. That meant there wasn't just one person out here. There was more than one. I got out of there quickly and didn't stop again until I was well away from that area. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the brush. Every sound felt sharper. Every bird call felt like an alarm. I don't think I'd ever felt so exposed before. I wasn't injured, I wasn't lost, but I was in a situation that felt deeply wrong. It felt like I had wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to see. Like I'd broken some unwritten rule just by noticing something that was meant to stay hidden. That night, I didn't set up camp. I just kept walking as long as I could. I had my headlamp and a backup battery, and I pushed until after dark. Finally, I stopped in a thicket near the last creek before the loop turned back to the trailhead. I didn't pitch the tent. I just used the sleeping bag and kept my bag packed in case I needed to move fast. I barely slept. First light, I moved again. I knew I had maybe 5 miles left to the trailhead. I walked fast. No breakfast. No breaks. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. Exactly how I'd left it. I opened the door, tossed my gear in, and sat behind the wheel for a few minutes before starting the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was on the highway, speeding toward other people. I didn't report anything. I thought about it, but what was I going to say? That I saw 2 tarp shelters and heard footsteps? That someone might have been following me? Maybe. I didn't see any crime. I didn't see weapons. There was nothing concrete. And if the people out there were hiding on purpose, they'd be long gone before anyone went to check. I haven't gone back to that trail since, and I think about it more often than I should. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see. Because of the silence. Because I felt like someone else was always one step behind me, just out of view. I hike other places now. I stay on popular trails. I don't go alone anymore. I don't go looking for peace in places where people disappear into the trees and don't want to be found. Because some places aren't just quiet, they're quiet for a reason. And if someone's living out there trying to stay invisible, I'm not interested in interrupting them again. I've lived in northern Australia my whole life, just on the edge of where the bush meets the wetlands. The kind of place where the roads slowly dissolve into cracked dirt and the air feels thicker the closer you get to the water. There are hiking trails through these areas, sort of. Most of them aren't official trails. Some are barely worn footpaths trampled by decades of fishermen and hunters and the occasional fool like me who likes to wander further than they probably should. I always liked being outside. I'm not really a social person, never have been. I like the quiet, the stillness. I like feeling like I'm the only person around for miles. That's one of the reasons I started going on longer solo hikes, sometimes into areas most people here wouldn't dare go without a proper group or some backup. But I was careful. Always let someone know where I was going. Carried a pack with first aid, snake bite kit, water, and a PLB. The works. I wasn't stupid, just liked being out where the wild still felt wild. The part of the bush I hiked through the most bordered the edge of a saltwater flatland. Not far from one of the rivers that fed into the estuary. You'd think it was just mangroves and mosquitoes, but there were higher dry spots too. Areas where you could walk without sinking. Some of it even had a kind of eerie beauty to it, especially early in the morning when the fog stuck to the water like a second skin. Now, I've had close calls before. Stepped too close to a taipan once. It was coiled under some dry leaves and I never saw it until it whipped off into the bush like a shot. Had a brown snake actually touch the side of my boot once. I stood so still my calves cramped, but nothing happened. I've been bitten by spiders before, the kind that make your arm swell and your temperature spike, but nothing deadly. The thing is, in Australia, most of the animals that can kill you don't give much of a warning. They don't growl or charge or posture. You step where you shouldn't and that's it. You either make it or you don't. So we don't worry too much about animals making noise in the dark. If something's being loud, it's probably not a threat. It's the quiet ones you should be scared of. Except crocs. I didn't used to worry about them that much. Don't get me wrong, I respected them. Anyone who grows up around here learns real fast that crocs aren't like snakes or spiders. They're not scared of you. They don't back off or hide. They don't bluff. If they want you, they'll take you. And once they do, you're not coming back. But you usually don't see them where I hike. Not often. Maybe 1 or 2 sightings a year. And even then, it's always heard from a mate or saw tracks near the creek kind of stuff. Crocs prefer deeper water and less hassle. I hiked mostly dry, inland routes with a few small creeks or billabongs, so I never gave them much thought. Not until last year. It was the middle of the dry season. No rain for weeks. The ground packed hard and cracked in places. I had a long weekend off work and decided to do a 2-night hike through one of my usual loops. It started near a waterhole that was half dried, then curved around a series of ridges before dipping down near an old riverbed that hadn't seen proper water in decades, then back up into dry eucalyptus forest before circling back. The first day was hot, not just warm, scorching. Even the birds seemed quieter. I only made about 10 kilometers before I found a decent patch of shade and set up camp. Nothing strange. I saw wallabies, distant dingoes, fresh scats from pigs. Heard some cockatoos fighting each other at dusk. Slept fine. The second day was hotter. I started early, right before dawn, and the air was already warm. The sun came up fast, and by mid-morning I was drinking more than I should have. I refilled from a small muddy creek I came across, filtering and boiling it just to be sure. Tasted awful, but it kept me going. The hike was rougher than I remembered. More loose rock, some erosion had wiped parts of the trail out. I pushed harder than I should have, determined to make it to a higher ridge where I could get a better view for the night. I made camp on the edge of that ridge as the sun dropped. It was a quiet evening. No wind, no distant engine sounds, no nothing. just the soft whine of insects and the dull settling of the bush into night. I remember thinking that the stillness felt heavier than usual, like the air had gone thick. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. My tent was small and stuffy. I unzipped it quietly, barefoot, and stepped outside. The air was cooler now but still didn't move. No breeze, nothing. I stepped a few paces from the tent and did my business, then stood there for a moment, just listening. You learn a lot from standing still in the dark out here. The sounds tell you what's around, where things are moving, what might be nearby, but there was nothing. No rustling, no chirping, no clicks. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when I saw the shape, down below the ridge, maybe 30 meters off, near what looked like the edge of an old dry gully. It was low to the ground, long. I thought it was a log at first, but it moved. Not fast, just slightly. A shift, a twitch. My heart kicked a little harder in my chest. I went back into the tent, zipped it closed, and sat there, listening. My pulse was in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just a pig, maybe a dingo, but pigs don't move like that, and dingoes aren't that long or that low. I slept like shit the rest of the night. Every crack of stick or rustle in the leaves had me holding my breath. When the sun rose, I packed up fast. I didn't eat breakfast, just shoved everything back in my pack and started moving. The trail dipped low through the gully I saw the shape in. I almost turned back, but I didn't have enough water to double back the full loop. I needed to make it to the next creek crossing to refill. It was about 5 kilometers ahead. When I got down into the gully, I slowed down, looked for tracks. The dirt was mostly dry and hard, but near the center, there was a soft patch. It had been damp not long ago, and something had churned it up. I bent down to look. There were no clear boot prints, but there were drag marks, deep ones, long, like something heavy had moved across the ground. My throat went dry. Crocs don't usually come this far inland during the dry, but maybe something had followed one of the creeks. Maybe it had been flushed out by the lack of food or competition. Whatever it was, it had been right here, probably last night. I moved fast after that. I reached the creek by early afternoon. It was more of a muddy trickle. I filtered and boiled water again, enough to last me until the car. I didn't want to stay out here another night. I figured I could make it back if I pushed hard. It would mean hiking in the dark, but I was okay with that. I'd done it before. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the heat finally broke. I could move easier, but I kept hearing things behind me. Little rustles, cracks, a splash once. I told myself it was just nerves, that maybe I was dehydrated, tired, imagining things. But then I heard the sound again, that same heavy shuffle from the ridge last night. I stopped walking, let my breath settle, and I listened. Came from the left, down near the water. Not close, maybe 20 meters. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. I kept moving, quicker now, but I didn't run. You don't run out here unless you're already dead. By the time I saw the dirt track that led back to the car park, it was full dark. I'd been walking for 12 hours straight. My legs ached. My feet were raw. I couldn't stop thinking about that shape. The drag marks, the stillness, all of it. When I reached the car, I tossed my pack in, slammed the door, and sat there with the engine off for a while, just breathing. My shirt was soaked. My hands shook. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if something had really followed me. I didn't see anything when I drove out. Didn't see anything when I got home. But I didn't hike for a while after that. Weeks passed before I even went back into the bush. And when I did, it was shorter walks, safer ones, places with clear paths and people nearby. Because here's the thing. You can go into the bush and come out fine 100 times. 1,000. You can laugh about spiders and snakes and heat and dehydration. You can call yourself bush smart and be careful and do everything right. But sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes something follows you. And if I had made one wrong step in that gully, if I'd camped 50 meters lower, if I'd lingered at the creek a little longer, I don't think I'd be here writing this. Because crocodiles don't warn you. And people who get attacked by them don't come back to talk about it. They just disappear. I grew up in Western Canada, the kind of place where you can walk outside and smell pine trees, hear the sound of a stream somewhere down the hill, and see a bear rummaging through your garbage if you forget to latch the bin. It wasn't unusual for us to see black bears, grizzlies, cougars, moose, even the occasional wolf if you got lucky or unlucky depending on the situation. I was used to all that. I wouldn't say I was fearless, but I didn't panic the way someone new to the area might. We were taught from a young age how to handle those situations. How to back away, how to stand your ground, when to run, when not to. It became second nature. So when I took a hiking trip through one of the coastal ranges on my own last fall, I didn't think twice about it. The plan was simple. 3 days in, 3 days out, following a trail I'd done parts of before but never fully end to end. The weather was cool, cloudy but not threatening, and the air had that crisp smell of early October, before the snow really starts to fall but after most of the bugs have disappeared. Felt like a perfect trip. I started off on the main trailhead just after sunrise. The first stretch of the trail was wide and well-maintained. It followed the edge of a steep slope, with thick evergreens packed tight on either side. The soil was damp from overnight rain, but not enough to make footing tricky. I made good time, covering close to 15 kilometers by early afternoon. That first night, I made camp near a small alpine lake. The trees opened up just enough to give me a view of the water, still and glassy, with low mist hanging just above it. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked a simple meal on my portable stove. I sat there for a long time, just watching the mist roll across the lake. The only sounds were distant birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful, the kind of solitude you can only get that deep into the woods. The second day was when things started to feel off. I broke camp early and got back on the trail. It narrowed and twisted more as I gained elevation, and the trees grew denser. Around midday, I stopped to eat and noticed tracks in the mud that didn't sit right. They weren't bear tracks, they were too narrow. They weren't deer either. I knelt down to look closer. The prints looked like they came from something canine, but they were big. Bigger than most dog tracks I'd seen. There were claw marks, deep ones, and the spacing between each step was long. Too long for a coyote, too big for a domestic dog. I thought about wolves, but something about the gait seemed wrong. Wolves usually move in a more predictable line, but these tracks wandered, sometimes doubled back, then stopped for a while and resumed again. It looked like whatever made them had been lingering, maybe sniffing around. I didn't dwell on it too long. I kept hiking, tried to write it off as an overly large stray or even just weird erosion patterns. But I started checking over my shoulder more often. The feeling of being alone in the forest had shifted into something else, something heavier. Later that day, I reached the highest point of my trip. The trail curved along the side of a ridge that overlooked a valley choked with pine. I paused there for a break. It should have been the best part of the hike, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept thinking about the tracks. Something didn't add up. That night, I made camp in a lower part of the valley. I was careful about where I set up, far from game trails, not near any water sources that animals might come to drink from. I hung my food well away from my tent and did all the usual things to avoid attracting wildlife. Still, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound that made my skin crawl. It was sniffing. Slow, deliberate sniffing just outside the tent. Not the frantic kind you get from a raccoon or even the curious snuffling of a bear. This was measured, steady, and too quiet. Whatever it was moved slowly around my tent, stopping now and then. I didn't dare move. I kept my breathing shallow and my eyes fixed on the fabric just inches from my face, hoping I wouldn't see a shadow pass by. The sniffing continued for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes. Then it stopped. I didn't hear it walk away. It just stopped. I lay there in total silence, straining to hear any sound at all. Eventually, I must have drifted off. In the morning, I went outside and checked the area. I found prints again, the same kind I'd seen earlier. They circled the tent, paused at my food bag, and then led off into the bush. I packed up fast and got moving. I didn't want to spend another night in that valley. The third day, I was more on edge than ever. I kept glancing into the trees, listening for sounds that weren't there. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the wind. I didn't stop for lunch. I barely drank water. I wanted out. Mid-afternoon, I came across a section of the trail that had partially washed out from a small landslide. It wasn't recent, but it meant I had to detour around the slope and into the bush. I marked my location with my GPS and cut into the trees, planning to link up with the trail again a few hundred meters down. That's when I found the carcass. It was a deer, or what was left of one. Its ribcage was torn open, and the legs were bent at unnatural angles. There wasn't much meat left, but the weirdest thing was the way it was arranged, like it had been dragged into a clear spot, stripped, and then just left there. No scavenger I knew did that. No bite marks, no signs of a fight. Just surgical-looking destruction. I backed away and didn't stop until I found the trail again. By then, the sun was starting to dip and the shadows were getting long. I had no choice but to camp one last night. I set up in a tight grove, surrounded by thick underbrush. It wasn't ideal, but it felt more hidden. I didn't start a fire. I ate cold food. I didn't want to draw attention. That night, I slept with my knife in my hand. Around midnight, I woke up again to movement. This time, it wasn't sniffing. It was pacing, back and forth. The footsteps were heavy but careful. I couldn't tell if it was 2 legs or 4. It didn't crash through the brush like a bear would. It didn't whine or growl. It just paced. Then it stopped. I could hear it breathing. Low, slow breaths. I held my own breath without meaning to. There was a long pause, and then it let out this short, low huff. Not a growl, not a bark. Just a huff. And then it left. No noise, no movement. Gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as it was light, I packed everything up and practically jogged the last 10 kilometers out. When I finally made it back to my truck, I didn't even take my boots off. I just drove. When I got home, I tried to tell myself it had to have been a wolf, maybe a big one, but I couldn't explain the pacing or the way it seemed to study me without making a sound. I mentioned it to an Australian friend later, someone I knew from traveling. He laughed and called me crazy, said I must have been hallucinating from being alone too long, said he'd take a bear over a funnel web spider any day. But I wasn't hallucinating. Something followed me out there. Something watched me. It didn't try to attack. It didn't even touch the tent. But it wanted me to know it was there. The scariest part is, I don't think it was trying to hurt me. I think it was curious, like it was trying to decide something, and that somehow made it worse. I still hike, but not alone. Not anymore. I go hiking a lot. I've lived in the same small town for most of my life, and it's the kind of place where the woods are just always there. They hug the edges of every neighborhood, break up the land between clusters of houses, and follow the roads out of town like a shadow. The forest isn't marked by neat trails or signs, just a thick and steady presence. Acres and acres of trees and brush and old paths that have existed longer than I've been alive. It's not wilderness in the way national parks are, but it's wild enough, quiet enough, and private enough to make you forget people are anywhere nearby. I started hiking those woods seriously when I was in my 20s, partly because I needed something to do to clear my head after work, and partly because I just liked the way the world felt out there. At first, I kept it to the afternoons. Then, I started pushing it later, especially in the summer when the heat stuck around long after sunset. Eventually, I found myself heading into the woods at midnight, sometimes even later. I liked being out there when the air was still and the sounds of town had died down. There were nights I'd hike for hours and wind up watching the sun rise through the trees before I made it back to the road. It became a routine, something I looked forward to, even though I didn't talk about it much. I always brought a small flashlight, but I barely used it. Your eyes adjust after a while, and the moonlight helps more than people think. I also brought a knife, which felt kind of silly at first, but enough nights alone in the woods and you start to want something solid in your hand. I never saw anything really dangerous out there. A few coyotes once, lots of deer, some foxes. Maybe once I spotted a black bear off in the distance, but it moved on fast. The woods were quiet in that way, busy with life but rarely threatening. The strange thing I saw happened in late October, a few years back. I remember the night clearly because the air had finally gotten cold enough that I had to wear my thicker jacket. The leaves were mostly off the trees, scattered across the trail and making that dry, crunching sound with every step. I set off around 11:30 p.m., figuring I'd be out there until morning. I had no real goal, just walk and breathe and think, the way I always did. That part of the woods I chose that night runs a few miles west of town. There's a narrow old road that leads into it, but it eventually gives way to footpaths and dirt tracks. No lights, no houses, no fences. Just trees and the occasional beer can left by teenagers. I followed a trail I hadn't taken in a while. It was a longer route, winding and mostly uphill, which meant I could go deeper into the woods than usual and still loop back in time for sunrise. About 2 hours in, I stopped to rest. The trail had narrowed, and I was in a patch of woods that felt different, thicker, older. The air was heavy with that deep forest smell. Rotting leaves, wet bark, something slightly sour. I sat on a fallen log, drank some water, and listened. No wind, no insects, just stillness. I remember how dark it felt there, not just visually, but physically, like the trees swallowed up the space around me. After a few minutes, I kept walking, mostly because staying still too long made me cold. I took a side path I didn't remember, one that looked more like something animals had made than people. I didn't really think about it. Sometimes those barely there trails led to cool spots like old rock walls or creeks. I figured I'd follow it a bit and then head back to the main trail. That's when I saw it. The ground started to open up in front of me, and the trees pulled back just enough to make space for something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was a pile of trash, something dumped illegally, maybe an old tent or some tarps. But as I got closer, I realized it was more than that. There were structures, crude ones, but clearly made by people. Sheets of corrugated metal leaned against sticks to form walls. Blankets strung over tree branches for roofs. Wooden pallets stacked to make beds. 5 or 6 of these little huts were spaced in a loose circle, with a small clearing in the center. Right in the middle of that clearing, an old tire had been turned into a fire pit, and inside it, a fire still burned. Not a lot, just low red embers, the kind that let you know someone had been there very recently. I stopped. I looked around, and everything in me went tense. It was silent. I mean, truly silent. I've been in the woods enough to know the difference between quiet and unnatural quiet. No rustling leaves, no snapping branches, no animal calls, not even the faint hum of wind. Just me and the fire and those makeshift homes. I waited, half expecting someone to step out of one of the huts. Maybe a group of squatters or some off-the-grid types. But no one came. I took a few more steps in, looking around carefully. There were personal items scattered about. Torn backpacks, dirty clothes, a few old shoes, an empty can of beans. Nothing recent, but not rotted either. It looked lived in and then suddenly abandoned. The huts were too small to stand in, so I crouched and peeked inside a couple. More signs of life. A plastic water jug, half full. A pile of newspapers from earlier that month. A pack of cigarettes and a rusted lighter. No sleeping bags or pillows, just flattened clothes arranged in a way that looked like someone had tried to make a mattress. And still, no people. The fire was the part one couldn't get past. You don't leave a fire going in the middle of the woods, not unless you're planning to come back. And if you've gone through the trouble of building shelters like this, you're not the kind of person to just wander off and forget. I didn't touch anything. I didn't call out. I didn't want anyone, if they were out there watching, to know I'd seen this place. Something about it all felt wrong. Not criminal, not dangerous in the usual way, but off. Like I had walked into a story that was already halfway done and I wasn't supposed to be there for it. I backed away slowly, retracing my steps to the trail. I didn't turn my light on, and I didn't stop moving until I was well out of sight of the place. I picked up my pace, hiking hard and fast back toward the trailhead. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, or see the glow of flashlights weaving through the trees, but there was nothing. Just the same unnatural silence, pressing in from all sides. I made it home just as the sky started to turn gray with dawn. I locked the door behind me, something I usually forgot to do, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on any lights. I didn't sleep that day. I kept thinking about the huts, the fire, the way that place felt like it had been left in a hurry, or maybe not left at all. For a few days, I didn't hike. Then, out of curiosity, or maybe something closer to obsession, I went back. In daylight this time, I took the same trail, found the same side path, followed it to the clearing. But it was gone. The huts were gone. The fire pit was gone. The trash, the clothes, the signs of life, everything had been cleared out. Not just left to rot or scattered by wind. Cleared. The ground looked recently disturbed, like someone had raked it or dragged something heavy across it. But otherwise, it was empty, like I had imagined the whole thing. I stood there for a long time. I turned in slow circles, scanned the trees for signs of movement, listened for any hint of life. Nothing. Just a patch of forest that looked like all the others. I never found it again. I kept hiking, sure, but I stayed away from that side of the woods. Even now, years later, I don't go back. And I still think about it more than I like to admit. What kind of people build something like that deep in the woods? Why leave so suddenly? Who keeps a fire going at midnight and then disappears? I've thought about calling someone, police, forest service, whoever. But what would I even say? That I found a camp and then it vanished? That I felt watched, even though I never saw anyone? No one would believe me, and maybe that's fine. I still go hiking. I still like watching the sunrise through the trees. But I don't stray from the main trails anymore. And I don't go out that late. Whatever I saw out there, I wasn't meant to find it. And I don't think I ever want to find it again. I've done a lot of solo hiking and camping over the years. Forests, mountains, deserts, you name it. If there's a trail and I've got a map, I'll take it. I've always liked being alone in the wild. No noise, no people, no distractions. It's quiet out there. Just wind in the trees, your own breathing, and whatever nature decides to throw at you. This happened about 2 years ago in northern Idaho. I was hiking a loop that wasn't super popular, but it was maintained well enough. It stretched about 40 miles with thick pine forests, rocky switchbacks, and a couple of valleys that dropped off into deep, wide basins. I planned on doing the whole loop in 3 days. I had my pack, food, gear, and a good idea of the weather. Everything was going fine until the second night. I'd hiked about 15 miles that day. My legs were sore but not shot. I stopped a few hours before sunset to set up camp. I found a flat spot about 30 yards off the trail, hidden well by a few boulders and tall trees. It was a good place, quiet, shaded, and not visible from the main path. That's always a rule for me when camping alone. Never camp where someone can see you from a trail. It's just safer that way. I made dinner, some rice and dehydrated veggies, and sat quietly, letting the sun go down. The forest around me was still. I heard the usual sounds. Some squirrels, wind in the trees, maybe the distant flap of a bird, but nothing out of the ordinary. By the time darkness settled in, I was already zipped up in my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I woke up. No real reason. I just opened my eyes. It was dead quiet. That wasn't strange by itself. But sometimes it's the quiet that feels loudest. It was so still, I could hear my own heart beating. I stayed there a moment, just listening. Then I heard it. A single crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. Not an animal. Too heavy. Deliberate. I froze. You do that instinctively when you know something isn't right. You don't want to make a sound. You don't even want to breathe too loud. Another step came from the trees behind my tent. Slow, careful. Someone was out there. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just laid there listening. The steps weren't steady. They'd stop for long periods, then shift just once or twice. Almost like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. At some point, I reached for my knife. I didn't unzip the bag or rustle too much. I didn't want to give myself away. I just slowly pulled it up next to me. I had bear spray in my pack too, but that was zipped up, and there was no chance I was making that kind of noise. Time passed. A lot of it, I think. Could have been minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, the steps stopped completely. I waited. Nothing. Not even a bird. At some point, I dozed off again. Not really by choice. Just from exhaustion, I think. But it wasn't good sleep. You can't really rest when something like that happens. In the morning, I got up early, earlier than I normally would. It was just getting light out. I stepped outside and looked around. The woods were calm again, but when I circled the tent, I found prints. Just one set. Human. They came from deeper in the woods, stopped about 20 feet from my tent, and then circled around it. Twice. Not right up close, but close enough that whoever it was could have seen inside if they'd wanted. The prints were deep. That meant a decent-sized person, maybe wearing boots. Not a barefoot hiker or a kid. The way they circled, slow, wide, deliberate. I got the feeling they were watching, not just passing through. That was enough for me. I packed up quickly. Didn't even make breakfast. I threw my stuff in the pack, grabbed the knife, and got moving. All day I felt like someone was following. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but I kept checking behind me. Every switchback, every turn. The hair on the back of my neck stayed up the whole time. I'd stop and wait sometimes, listening. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I made it back to my car by late afternoon. When I finally saw it at the trailhead, I felt that tension break just a little. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the next town. I stayed in a motel that night. Didn't even think about sleeping in the car. I needed 4 walls and a locked door. Something about that night didn't sit right. Still doesn't. Here's the thing. Animals don't circle you like that. They don't creep up quiet and linger. And if it was another hiker, what were they doing out there at midnight, 30 miles from any road, without making themselves known? Why circle my tent? Why stand still for so long? I think about it now and then. I try to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was just someone passing through who didn't want to wake me. Maybe they were lost and scared. But the way those steps came and went, the way they circled, it didn't feel accidental. It felt planned. Nobody good ever visits your camp in the middle of the night. And even if they do, you still don't want to meet them. I haven't stopped hiking. I haven't stopped camping either. But now I carry a satellite beacon. I carry a bigger knife. And I don't sleep so deeply anymore. I still like the quiet. I still like being alone. But I'm more careful now. Because that night taught me something. Just because the woods are silent doesn't mean you're alone. And not everyone out there wants to be found.